So as you know, I am a huge proponent of good data, and good data helping us make good decisions. So I'm happy to share with you some of the findings from this year's Civic Census. Now I should tell you that this year is what we call a base census. That means that we really only are talking about population counts. You'll recall that last year we asked some questions around things like age and gender and so on, and I was able to get into some of the more demographic data of how the city is changing. I was pleased to see that the the federal government census, Statistics Canada census, came out and really reiterated a lot of the things we know about Calgary around our population pyramid, younger people moving here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But today we're really just going to talk about overall population numbers. So first of all, why do we do a civic census? I should point out as well that the civic census is a remarkably solid methodology. Melanie was telling me yesterday that we have about a 98% response rate. So this is very solid data. And the reason that we do an annual civic census is for really threefold. The first two areas are planning and policy, because we really need to understand, in a dynamic city like Calgary that is growing and changing so quickly, we need to understand shifts in population, the neighborhoods people are moving to and out of, how the city is changing on an annual basis in order to do our planning. And it also is incredibly important as we think about public policy. You know, for example, when we looked last year at things like age and gender, and we realized that the city, although our population pyramid looks better than most cities because young people move here, is aging just like every other city. And it means we need to build new kinds of housing stock and new kinds of neighborhoods, new kinds of social services in order to manage that. The other very basic reason is that some of our funding is on a per capita grant basis. And to have annual numbers instead of every 5-year numbers as we would get from the Canada census really make a difference to the grant money that we receive. And all the analysis we've ever done shows that the increase in the grants far outweighs the cost to do an annual civic census. Let's get to some of the results. So as you can see, we had a year of pretty solid population growth in 2011-2012. So our population is up. Our population is up, and in fact the number that I've got on my little list does not match the number in your little book. So you've got the number in your little book. But we're over $1.1 million now. 1.1 million people, I should say. A lot more than $1.1 million. 1.1 million people now. And as you can see, we have received significantly higher, thank you. 1.12 to be exact. 1,120,225, which is up almost 30,000 residents from the previous year, 29,289. No secret that our population has been growing. We maintain our status as one of the largest growing and fastest growing major urban municipalities in the city. We have been seeing significant population growth almost in every year since 1988, where this graph starts. Even the decline in 2010, where we saw a little bit of out-migration, natural increase still certainly made up for that. So if you want to look at where that change is coming from, fundamentally there are two areas that population change comes from. The first is natural increase. That's births over deaths. And the second is migration. And so with the exception of the downturn here, we've always had quite positive net migration. And you see that the net migration is increasing significantly again. So the net migration is approximately 19,600 people moving to Calgary, which is a significant increase over the previous year. And natural increase is about, it's pretty constant, 9 or 10,000 babies over being born over people passing away. So what we really see here is that the story of our growth now is a story of migration. It's a story of people moving here. I love this. What this map is really showing us is that we've seen a significant change over the last 5, 7, 10 years in how people are moving to Calgary and the neighborhoods they choose to live in. I remember when I was sitting on that side of the room in 2005, a year where we had very significant population growth in Calgary. About 75 to 80% of Calgary neighborhoods lost population that year. We were putting all of the young families and all of the new growth on the fringes of the city, and people were moving out of other neighborhoods, developed neighborhoods, if you will. At the same time as kids moved away from home, fewer people were living in each house and so on. So while that trend has not exactly turned itself completely around, it's really quite different now. And you'll see that in the gray are neighborhoods where there was essentially no population change, where they stayed relatively level, plus or minus 1%. The red and orange are neighborhoods that lost population, and you'll see that there's actually very, very, very few of those, and particularly very few of those that are darker in color. In other words, where lots of people are leaving as the neighborhoods change. And as you get to darker green, you see that those are neighborhoods that have gained population, and you'll see in particular the largest belts of population gain in the north central, northwest areas of the city. Panorama Hills, let's see if I can find it on here, that one there I think, maintains its status as the largest neighborhood in Calgary, as well as the neighborhood that had the largest absolute increase in population this year. And that is not changed from last year. I thought the other thing that you might, and we can get more into the neighborhood stuff if you're interested. It is actually very, very interesting, and you'll see that in the book that you've got. I also thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of housing, in terms of new dwelling units, how housing is shifting and changing over time. I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I will. You know, I recently read in the newspaper, because I do read newspapers, one of the people representing the home builders in Calgary talking about how their industry has been devastated and it's a real problem. And man, oh man, oh man, if I was in the private sector and I lived in an industry where my revenue increased by 23% year over year, and in fact, if you look at the 2011 to 2012 numbers, you'd see a 53% increase. Not exactly sure I would use that word devastated to describe my business. In fact, we have an enormously healthy business in housing starts, enormously healthy. 23% higher than 2010, 53% higher year to date in 2012 over 2011. So we really are seeing a lot of homes being built. What is interesting is the pattern is slowly changing. Over the last 10 years, the split of multifamily to single family homes has been 1/3, 2/3, 33-66. And what we see this year is almost half and half, 43-57. In 2010, by the way, this really fluctuates. This is not a constant trend. In 2010, it was 20% multifamily, 80% single family. So we really are responding to different kinds of market needs. The other thing that is very interesting is we're starting to see a real shift in where the growth is happening in relation to some of the goals of Planet Calgary and other places. So 42% of housing starts now are in communities that are already developed, not in new suburban communities. That is substantially above the 10-year average. And we also see that 58% is in developing communities, which is somewhat below the 10-year average as well. So the market, in fact, is causing these shifts, not just regulation. And so we are seeing that people are looking differently at how they can live within the community, and that is one of the very, very interesting things that really has come out of this survey. There's been some question around land supply. And remember that our land, or when we calculate land supply, that only includes land in developing areas. It only includes land on the fringe of the city. We don't include land within the developed areas. And you'll see when we've got about 42% of our housing starts in those neighborhoods that our land supply situation is actually extraordinarily healthy. Extraordinarily healthy. And we are ready to manage the growth that we are seeing. So all in all, a good news story. People are moving here, the economy is vibrant, they're excited to move here, we are able to accommodate them, and we continue to have a growing and vibrant and exciting city. So that is this year's census. Questions? I love
if there are no questions.
So much data.
Could I ask you, what is the 10-year pattern? So that those 58-42 is the mix new.
Let me see if I've got the real numbers for you here.
All right, I can get that later. That's more of a actual number. But let me ask you this.
I've got the absolute numbers, but those won't help you for your
Fair
story.
enough.
So.
Let me ask you this. The target in Planet Calgary was over, I think, in a 60-year time frame, have half the population, half the new population brought into existing communities and 50% in, now, of course, units and based on family patterns, units and population are the same, but
We're certainly moving in the right
do you
direction.
think do you think we have to start getting on the gas pedal little with this?
No, I don't think so, actually, because the goals that you're stating are 60-year goals. And remember that Planet was only implemented 2007, right? 2008? 2008. So it's only 4 years ago. So certainly we're starting to see movement in that area. And largely, and I have to underline this is market driven. As the city gets larger, people don't want to drive as far. People start taking a second look at rebuilding, renovating, buying homes in existing neighborhoods. So the market is absolutely responding in the way we thought they would. And the role for us from a policy perspective is to ensure that we are making that easy. So for example, one of my great passions, as you all know, is cutting red tape. And one of the areas that we're really focused on in that is looking at how do we make it easier for a family that wants to move into an existing neighborhood to get their permits to renovate an old house or to tear down a house on a big lot and build a duplex. And those are really the sorts of things that we, from the policy perspective, can do to support these market changes.
I'd like to ask a question, but it's not about the census.
Let's go through all the census stuff first.
And
Rick, if there's
I'll go on
anything
hold
else.
until then.
Okay.
What story does the multi-family growth tell about our city?
I can hear you and I can't see.
Sorry, I know this is awkward.
There you are.
I'll try again. What
Okay.
story does the multi-growth tell about our city?
Well, I think what it really says is that there really is a market demand for new kinds of housing. You know, for a long time, Calgary seemed to be in an area where we would build single-family homes and high-rise apartment buildings. And what we're really seeing is that there's an enormous market demand for quite a shift. Things like row houses and duplexes and so on, in addition to high-rise condo buildings, and in particular, we see a lot of mid-rise buildings, right? A lot of 4- and 5-story kinds of buildings that a lot of folks in urban planning would say is the sweet spot for multifamily. You know, townhouses on the bottom and perhaps a couple of floors of condos above or retail on the bottom. So what we're seeing is a lot of innovation. We're seeing a lot of shift and change, and we're really seeing the market respond. That people are very, very interested in buying these sorts of homes. I see no bubble in terms of condos or anything like that happening right now. What I am seeing is a market that is very, very, starting to get very innovative and very responsive.
Is this pattern or this pace of growth, I mean, if we continue on this way for a number of years, is this really going to be sustainable for the infrastructure of the city?
That's an excellent, excellent question. And for those who didn't hear it, the question was, is this pattern of growth sustainable over the long term for the city? And the real answer there is yes, but we have to make a lot of changes. You know, when we look back at some of these peaks here and here and here, the city may not have been ready for that level of growth. In particular, you know that through the 1990s, we didn't invest a lot in infrastructure, and we had to play a lot of catch up through the early part of the 2000s. In addition, we had economic incentives in place that really made it easier to build fringe growth that was lacking things like fire halls and swimming pools and libraries and so on. So what we've really tried to do is create a more level playing field for developed community and developing community growth, as well as try and get ahead of the infrastructure bubble. One of the really nice things about this period from 2009 to 2011 is we still built a lot of stuff. Instead of saying the city's not growing, let's put a pause on infrastructure, we tried to get ahead of the curve. So right now we're feeling a little bit better. Now, of course, we're going to have very significant infrastructure pressures going forward, very significant. And we've got to figure out a way to fund those. The other dirty little secret about all of this is that by most calculations, because we only have property tax and user fees to fund our operating budget, people who move to Calgary are actually a net drain on the Calgary budget, not a net increase to it. Because you've got to provide police and fire and library service and so on. So part of our discussions with provincial government around the city charter are not really about finding new forms of taxation as that's been spun. They're actually about figuring out a sustainable sharing of revenue going forward so that people who move here actually contribute to the functioning of the city rather than cost us money. And we're not there yet. We've certainly made huge strides that way. We figured out the acreage assessment system for new development, for example, in a good way, but we're not there yet. And those are probably the most important conversations we can have going forward.
So, forgive me, Mayor, but does that mean that the number of in-migration is almost a red flag in some ways if this trend continues?
Well, growth isn't a bad thing. It's perverse for the mayor of Calgary to sit here and say growth is bad. It's bad for the city budget, but it's very, very good for the economy, for vibrancy, for the province, for the country. What we need to do is we just need to figure out how to provide the services that we're mandated to provide, clean water and fire and police, to all these people every single day. And we'll get it right. We'll get it right. Because nobody does not understand that this is perverse incentives to say growth is bad, right? What we need to do is we need to figure out how to manage growth. And that's something that we politicians have to do at the policy level.
And you see real positive change as far as density, as far as some of the trends the city wants to go in?
I do. Even when you look at the brand new communities on the suburban fringe, they're quite different than the ones that were built 5, 7, 10 years ago. They're easier to serve by transit, they're more mixed use, they encourage people to spend more of their lives within the community and less driving on the streets that are already clogged. And it's easier for a family to get by with one car instead of 2, 3, or 4. That makes a big difference. And it took us a while to get there, but I think we're there, and we'll just continue to improve that.
Last question for me, sorry, but does that mean if it's a market-driven thing that the city doesn't necessarily need the policy, or is this something that the city has to get stronger with?
They have to go hand in hand. What we had before was a city policy that actually skewed the playing field. There was no market. Because if we were subsidizing every new house in the suburbs $15,000 versus buying a house in a developed community, that's not a level playing field. And what we're really trying to do is create a system where the market can work. No one's saying don't buy a single family house. What we're saying is build single family homes and price them according to how much it costs to service them. And then people can make a decision, is that worth it to me? That's how the market works. And so what we're really trying to do is create a level playing field and a real free market in all of this.
Given that that new population will end up being a net drain on the budget, are these numbers, do these match the city's budget projections? And if not, how does the city adjust to that?
So, you asked what sounds like a really simple question and has a really complex answer. Do you want the really complex answer?
Let's start with this.
The simple answer is yes. Nothing in here is going to knock the city's budget out of into the water at all. The more complex answer is that the way that we calculate property tax using the revenue neutral tax assessment actually actually accounts for this with a 1-year lag. So we're never going to be way out because of the incredibly, I think, overly complex way in which we calculate our assessments.
In talking about how it's good news that we're starting to see more of the population distribution around the city and the work that still needs to be done in infrastructure, are there any particular neighborhoods or areas that the city want to see in there where there's more work that needs to be done, or any key target areas?
Well, we always have to think about growth of the city in 3 ways. The first is increased numbers of people living in the middle of the city, in the downtown and the neighborhoods surrounding downtown. And on that front, after some hiccups after the economic downturn in 08-09, we really are very, very strong. It's a good, healthy market. It's not a crazy market like some other cities in Canada where you wonder how it's going to sustain itself. But there's a good, healthy market. Lots of people moving downtown. I'm very, very, very optimistic about the East Village and the opportunity to create stuff there about what's going on in the Beltline and so on. So that part is going well. Number 2, when you think about the fringes, we are always going to have new suburban growth. No one's saying stop new suburban growth, nor would anyone say that. However, at the fringes, we needed to figure out the economic incentives. We needed to stop subsidizing a certain form of housing, and we needed to make sure that we were funding the infrastructure that was needed, and we're on our way there. The new deal that we signed with the development industry last year gets us about halfway to where we need to go. But it's starting to change. The format and the skin of those communities is starting to look quite different. Then the other part is, what about all those developed neighborhoods? What about the Whitehorns and the Dalhousie's and the Acadias? Those neighborhoods that are getting older, that you have a lot more empty nesters, you have a lot more seniors and so on. How do we encourage young families to want to live in those neighborhoods, to fill up those schools, to use the rec centers that already exist and so on? That's the harder part, because people love their neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are great. They live there because they're great neighborhoods. And so how do we make change that is sensitive and improves the neighborhood? And that will always be a challenge, but I think people in Calgary are really starting to think of things in new ways. They're starting to say, look, If I want my schools and rec centers to stay open and be vibrant, then I gotta look at that derelict strip mall at the end of my street with the 7-Eleven and the pizza shop and say, there could be something else there. It might still have a 7-Eleven and a pizza shop, but maybe it has housing above it. Or maybe there's an opportunity on that lot for us to bring in a place where seniors can live, so as they move out of their homes, they can stay in the neighborhood. And those are the kinds of things we really need to think through, and we're just at the beginning of that journey. But I'm optimistic that we'll be able to get there.